Hi, everyone. This is Ali John Chaudhry, psychotherapist, and I'm here today with Fern. Great to have you here, Fern.
Oh, it's great to be with you as always. I'm Fern Schumer Chapman. I survived Thanksgiving. Um, of course, as you know, I don't struggle in the same way others who are estranged because I have reconciled with my only brother. But it's taken a long time to rebuild that relationship. We are now reconciled for 8 years. And though we didn't spend Thanksgiving together, it doesn't bother me in the same way it did back in the day when we never spoke to each other. You know, my brother and I had so many decades of cutoff. And when my mother came to me 8 years ago and begged me to intervene and help my brother, who was in a very dark place, I really didn't know what to do because I felt I had a lot of obligations to my mother and the family. And I also felt I had certain boundaries that I needed to respect of my own. I wanted to protect myself. And the problem I had, Ollie John, was I started to feel really guilty that if I didn't intervene, I had failed my mother and the family.
Mm.
So, you know, I think that raises some fundamental questions about how guilt guides us. And guilt is so tied to expectations. I'm really eager to hear some of what you have to say about what it is and how we manage it.
Absolutely. I think that this is a good segue into today's theme because I think that guilt and sibling estrangement is a big one because this is something that comes off from our viewers regularly in terms of conversations and things they go through. So I definitely think that this is a subject matter that's of particular interest to our viewers. So I'm really excited about this episode today. Um, so how about if we get into a definition of what guilt is? I think that that's an important one to start us off. So yeah, so according to researchers Michelli and Castle-Frenchy, guilt is a self-conscious emotion that involves negative evaluations of the self, feelings of distress, and feelings of failure. So I think that that's an important aspect for us to consider in light of what our viewers tend to experience when it comes to their sibling estrangement relationship. Because I think that guilt can sometimes be a signal that is helpful to us. It could be a legitimate feeling, and as a psychotherapist, this is what I tell people. I think that it's good to listen to what our feelings tell us. But it can sometimes happen that feelings will fall into an excessive or harmful type of direction. And I think that that's when we need to explore if it's really pouring into other areas of our lives. And if that's the case and it's making our days hard, then it's important we address that.
You know, I think particularly if you were the fixer in the family, which I was and still am to a large extent, you're often riddled with guilt. That's what's driving your reactions. And being a fixer is not necessarily a satisfying role because obviously we only can control our own behavior, and you're really not going to have a huge influence on others. But it is interesting how so many of us are fixers in the sibling relationship, and we try to take on much more than we really can control.
Absolutely. And I think that the fixer is certainly something that comes up that can be an issue for a number of us because it sometimes happens that it overlaps onto our role as being the scapegoat or black sheep. So what ends up happening is that there's a sense of being dumped that responsibility to make things better with regards to the relationships in the family. I know that it's happened to me as well with my own father, where he was basically putting pressure on me to fix the relationship with my sister, and it's not always that easy. And I think that there's a variety of different factors that come into play when there's different things that happen in a sibling relationship. So I think that that's important also to recognize what you just said there, the notion of being the fixer and not falling into a pattern that can sometimes enable us and enable others rather in their inappropriate behavior.
Yeah, you know, with enabling, which is another piece of all this, I think of it often as being a little bit like a bystander, but worse, because you're actually facilitating bad behavior. So you really have to have that third eye out to what you're doing and how it is affecting not just you, but the relationship. It's not necessarily a winning game when you're enabling.
No, and that's the thing. It's many complex dynamics are at play. We think sometimes we can get into a pattern of fixing things, but what ends up happening is, in other cases, what we're doing is we're continuing with the same behavior that may enable a person that's narcissistic, for example, to pursue or to continue on or blame you in that sense. So this is something that can happen typically in different sibling estrangement contexts. So it's important not to forget what's happened in the past and such, you know. So I think that that's something that's important to consider. And let's also consider that guilt can also have an effect on us on a physical level. And the thing that we sometimes don't always take into consideration is that if we don't deal with guilt, it can turn into anxiety or depression symptoms, insomnia, muscle tension in some cases, regret, rumination, and guilt can really cause us to question our actions. And if it's left unaddressed, then it can actually turn into a pattern of shame. We can start, for example, to think that there's something wrong with us or something that's just not good in our own notion of self-worth.
Well, I have a question for you though, because I think a lot of times I've felt like I had a rather really unpleasant choice, which was between feeling guilty or feeling resentful. In other words, I was swinging between my responsibilities and my sense of protection for myself.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's something that comes up with a lot of us, because if we're not careful, we can tend to put an over responsibility on ourselves. And that's really what this back and forth does in some ways, is basically you're swinging back and you're starting to take on certain aspects of the relationship that are not really yours. And that's where it's important to recognize that it's a two-way relationship and it's not a one-way street. And it's really important to recognize that it's individual chemistry, the ability to tolerate discomfort, and proper conflict management skills, are all factors that play into the outcome of a relationship. So it's really important to be careful about this particular aspect with regards to over responsibility. And if you try to control things that are outside of yourself, what ends up happening is that basically you're trying to control something that is not in your control. So that's a recipe for disappointment if you're not careful. And it's really important to be and have a modest view of yourself in the situation. So I always like to think that that's a quality that's important, because a lot of us are open in terms of our personality traits. You know, if we're empathic, we're definitely open. And that openness can sometimes play into us, right? Because we're always going to be upturning certain rocks and saying, well, there's something I'm missing here in the relationship. There's just this one thing that I could be doing, I could make it better. And I think a lot of us do this. This is typical, but I think that at the same time, it's good to leave ourselves with an open question when we're searching for something. And sometimes just seeing how we can get creative in different ways in terms of making the relationship better. If you're still having contact at all with your sibling, it's good to leave it as an open question, because we all get flashes of insight, like that aha moment. Oh, yes, I could be doing this. Oh, I could be talking about this. Oh, well, if I get into this benign interest, then it won't spiral out of control. So that's something that can be better, I think, for us to avoid over responsibility.
So really, I just had an aha moment. So really what you're saying is the choice is not necessarily between guilt and resentment. it's the choice of examining my sense of responsibility.
Yes, because it can spin in any which direction we want, but if you're personalizing it and taking on too much, that's the fuel for the guilt. That's the fuel for the negative emotions. So if you get it at the source, then in that way, you can work at it to counter that. So that way you're neutralizing the fuel that guilt needs to pursue forward. So, yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. And another thing that's important is that, you know, we're all subject to interdependence. We're relational beings, right, Fern? I think that's one of the things that we recognize in ourselves. And I think it's no surprise that socialization increases happiness. We know this now in terms of positive psychology. And it's really important that we recognize that, because I'm still thinking of Tom Hanks, where he's on his island in Castaway, and he had his Wilson ball basically as his person to talk with, you know. And actually, that's a really important outline for why we need relationship. It's to stay sane. So I think that's really, really important. And I mean, we've talked about loneliness before, you and I, right? And I mean, we've talked about what that can do, but it's also important to consider that that if we're not careful with what loneliness can do to us, is that it can create mistrust in establishing a link with other people, and it can give us a sense of low self-esteem, or even a fatalistic attitude if we're not careful, and saying, oh well, it might not work out. Oh, and so if you know, there's a saying that goes that how does it go basically? If you think you can do it or you can't, you're right. So I actually like that saying, you know, so it illustrates very well the importance of being able to reach out and establish relationships, which are very important. So relationships with other people, friends, coworkers, maybe somebody else in your family, whatever it is that can give you a sense of connectedness is important. So even
I think too that there's a rush to judgment in your brain. So we have a tendency to connect the dots and not necessarily accurately. And one of the great values of having close relationships, or at least relationships in which you can confide, is that they can help you to sort out whether you're rushing to judgment or not, if you're way too far down that path.
Exactly. And this is where we can recognize with others if we're being too overly responsible, if we're taking on too much. Are we being proportionate with ourselves, or are we not? And sometimes we need that outside view of somebody else that can help us to see that. And that's why sometimes therapy can be good as well, for people to explore that, to help to heal some of our negative feelings if they've been festering for a long time. No? Now, I do think that there's a few recommendations we can have with our viewers. What do you think, Fern? Should we get into some of our recommendations?
Yes.
Okay. So I think that a couple of things that I'd like to suggest, first of all, is, you know, a good question to ask ourselves is, what would our protector do? What would our protector suggest to us right now when we're experiencing guilt? Already, whatever comes from that answer will be something that will be positive and helpful. So let yourself get acquainted with that protector within yourself. Make that part into whatever you want it to be. Make it look as if any image you like that works with that. And that will help you to have a counter voice to the guilt in that way. So
and I think in my case, often my protector would say, why is this your responsibility?
Good question. So let yourself go down that rabbit hole. That's a good rabbit hole to go down to explore. You know, how is this your responsibility? And basically just deconstructing whatever it is that you think makes this about you. So I think that's really important. And another part that we can get in touch with also is, whenever our critical voice gets turned on, to talk with what is our compassionate voice. I think that's an important one as well with regards to that, because we tend to blame ourselves a lot. If we look at ourselves in the past, maybe this is an established pattern with some of us. So having our compassionate voice come in can be something that can be interesting to see, because it can perhaps help us to see in the past if what we've been doing is still occurring right now, you know? And so I think that that's another counter voice that we can use with the protector as well, that voice of compassion.
I mean, I think what we're trying to do is to tweeze out where we are empathetic and where we are compassionate and where we are overly responsible. And, you know, this is a mix that's very dangerous, particularly for people who are deeply compassionate and empathetic. They often edge towards enabling. And so I think what you're trying to help the viewer do is to set some clear boundaries as to what's acceptable compassion versus what is being overly responsible.
Exactly. Exactly. There's always a healthy expression of a particular attribute that we have, and there's an unhealthy expression of that. So we are talking about the healthy expressions of compassion. So always recognize the two sides to that is very important. And another thing that's also important for our viewers to know is that there's a good book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, and that's by author Bronnie Ware. And she identified some of the regrets that people had on their deathbeds, especially at the end of their lives. And I think of particular interest to our viewers is the fact that we can choose to be happy. And this is one of the top 5, as a matter of fact. It's important to recognize that while we all have a basic happiness level, all of us, it's completely realistic for us to consider the possibility that we can increase our happiness maybe 1%, 2%, you know? So I think that that's important to consider how we can do that. And if you want, Fern, I can walk you through a simple exercise if you'd like today. Would you like that?
Yeah, we have a few more minutes and you can do that. One of the things I wanted to add to what you just said is there is actually a science to how to be happy. And you can find books on this topic. And you can change your level of contentment through these practices.
I agree. There's a lot out there on positive psychology and happiness. It's been studied. So definitely it's good for our viewers to do some research, and perhaps we can talk about that. But here's one exercise we can do that will actually be helpful for us to practice and perhaps to bring into our own sense of inner reflection. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of an exercise, Fern. And basically what this exercise is I'm going to ask you a simple question. If compassion were to live in your body, where do you think it would live?
Me personally?
Yes.
Right underneath my heart.
Okay. So basically that place you've chosen for compassion is just underneath your heart in that way. So, okay, so that's where your compassion lives. Now, if you were to let yourself just go into that space right now, just for a few moments, allowing yourself just to go into that space, however big or small it is, it doesn't matter. Allowing yourself just to connect with that particular area in your body. Letting yourself dwell there. Letting yourself experience what you need to experience in that place. And now what we can do is we can ask ourselves, does compassion live somewhere else in your body? And it's okay if it doesn't, but if there's another place, that's fine too.
Mostly there.
Okay, so in that particular area, that's where it is for you. Okay, so allow yourself simply then to work with this particular area which you've just gotten acquainted with right now. And I'm going to ask you to simply allow yourself to increase your compassion by 1 to 2% inside of you. Simply allowing that to flourish and grow for 1 to 2%. Letting yourself breathe into this new space. And when you're there, just let me know.
Okay.
All right. And now what we'll finally do is allow for that same feeling now that's been activated within you to simply let that feeling pour into the place where you would typically experience guilt. Letting it simply pour into that place. Letting it simply go naturally and organically into that space. Letting it take care of you. Letting it do what it does naturally. Letting that gentleness happen.
It helps.
Excellent. So I'm really glad that you were able to experience that, Fern, because this is a gentleness that we all need to experience for ourselves.
Well, I had this visualization while you were talking of the Dr. Seuss story where the Grinch's heart grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And, you know, he finally is not so grinchy about Christmas. And so I was kind of imagining the space growing bigger and bigger.
Very nice. So I think we're approaching the end of our session right now. And I think this is a good stopping point for us now. I know we're a little bit out of time. So just allowing our viewers to know, and I just want to thank you, by the way, Fern, for participating with me today on this. This was really important. And just letting our viewers know, of course, that we'll be continuing to produce videos into the new year. And we're doing our next sibling estrangement group in December. It's going to be happening. And we're planning on continuing this every single month. So,
yeah. And maybe some of our viewers could write in the comments about the guilt that they struggle with. What makes them feel guilty and what do they do to reduce it?
Absolutely. I think that that's very, very important. So we'd love to hear from our viewers. What is it that you do that's been helpful after doing this exercise or any other exercise that helps you to reduce that guilt? So definitely, we'd love to hear from you. Again, of course, our viewers are our best publicity. It's important we get the word out about sibling estrangement. So please do like or share our videos. It's very important for us to get the word out. There's so little resources on sibling estrangement out there. So please go ahead and feel free to do that. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. I think that's really important also to do that. Basically, you're allowing yourself to spread the message with regards to empowering ourselves with the experience of sibling estrangement. So I encourage all of our viewers to keep on listening and keep on empowering themselves. And of course, we do have the private group Sibling Estrangement, Sharing, Coping, Connecting on Facebook. So if anybody wants to join, they can certainly feel free to do that. Fern, you've got your own author page as well if people want to get in touch with you. So I think that that's really, really good. So once more, we're out of time, so I gotta end it now. So, but thank you so much, Fern, for being here. I really appreciate you doing this again, and I look forward to our next video.
I do too, and I'm always struck by the fact that those of us who have been estranged or are estranged or even reconciled, we're not alone. Great to be with you. See you next time.
All right, you take care, Fern.
Thanks.